The danger of self-detonation is well known and well documented. It is the very reason that chemical engineers pay special attention to the labeling, storing, and care of all substances. In China, only 4 years later, an explosion devastated the port of Tianjin near Beijing. The blast was large enough to be seen from space. Registered on the earthquake scale,
eyewitnesses who saw them said it was a nuclear explosion.
And detonated with the force of over 300 tons of TNT. China is one of the world's largest economies, but it wasn't always the global superpower we know it as today. In the 20th century, this vast country opened its doors to trade and took huge leaps forward to challenge the capitalist economies of the West and bring hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty and into a quality of life previously thought unattainable for any communist economy.
Today we take another step in the historic normalization of relations which we have begun this year.
China basically implemented an open-door policy which allowed it to trade with the United States and other countries in 1978. The open-door policy had such an effect on China's economy that the country's GDP went from 150 million in 1978 to over 12 trillion just a couple of years ago.
China's growth is phenomenal. It's tangible.
Development and expansion take place around the clock.
You can see it in the thousands of skyscrapers being erected and the hordes of new cars on the roads.
It brought 600 million people out of poverty. It really brought about this global commercialization of China.
China's economy is set to overtake Germany next year to become the third largest in the world after the USA and Japan.
China went from the Cultural Revolution with Mao Zedong to really modernizing and changing at quite a rapid pace that it hadn't before.
We're facing two choices: go on speeding and growing until we crash, or slow down so that the reform is more fair and gets wider support from Chinese society.
Even Chinese government advisors are talking about an economy like a car out of control.
Beijing is really I think it's fair to call it a sprawling metropolis. It's really grown, especially in the last couple of decades. It's really expanded now. It's now a very modern place as well. You see a lot of high-rise buildings, lots of modern architecture.
It's gone from marshland to glittering metropolis in just a decade. The lights of rampant capitalism are burning brightly here on the eastern edge of this vast communist country. It's little wonder this is shaping up to be China's century.
Tianjin is a port city that's about 84 miles southeast of Beijing. Even though it's so close to Beijing, in proximity, it's actually still its own metropolis. There's about 11 million people living in Tianjin. Tianjin is really Beijing's access to the sea. It allows goods from ships to be brought to land via Tianjin and straight to Beijing. It's really quite a commercialized port. I know a lot of different businesses work there or use it to import materials.
Tianjin is the largest port in northern China and one of the largest in the world, covering 121 square kilometers. The port trades with over 600 ports in 180 territories around the world, making it vital to China's economy and status as the largest exporter in the world. Ruhai Logistics are based in the northwest corner of the port. They specialize in the storage, transfer, and distribution of hazardous chemicals.
Ruhai Logistics had a series of warehouses in the Tianjin port. To give you an idea of scale, it was about 10 football pitch size of warehouses, so it's a huge amount of warehousing.
Although this was a licensed chemical storage area, the quantity of chemicals stored there, and very dangerous chemicals, was far in excess of what was allowed. Some of the most dangerous chemicals, for example, potassium nitrate and sodium cyanide, which we know were stored at this plant, are limited to 25 tonnes of storage under legislation.
There are about 800 tonnes of ammonium nitrate. It's used as a fertiliser. It's also an explosive.
There was an excess of 800 tonnes of sodium cyanide on that site, and over 1,300 tonnes of potassium nitrate.
Something like 3,000 tonnes in total of hazardous and toxic chemicals.
On the 12th of August 2015, we started hearing these reports about this possible explosion that happened in China. So we started looking into it.
We know that there was a fire.
A fire started about 11 p.m. or it was reported sometime before 11 p.m.
Firefighters were called out to tackle a blaze in the port area.
At the time, it wasn't known what was actually being stored there.
The initial fire was fought with water. The people who were fighting the fire didn't realise that the chemicals stored would react violently with water. The first explosion happened about 30 minutes later. "30 seconds after that, the main explosion happened.
These massive explosions.
There were fireballs which went hundreds of meters into the air and could actually be seen from space.
People described it a lot like a bomb going off. Eyewitnesses who saw the explosion said it was how they would imagine a nuclear explosion.
The effects went out so far that apartment blocks 2 kilometres away had their windows broken.
The force of the explosion measured 2.9 on an earthquake scale.
When the explosion happened, it knocked out power in a lot of these nearby buildings. Multiple story, tall apartment buildings. The lifts were all out. All the way up, there were people in the apartments. Doors that were, I'd say, several inches thick, that had been blown straight off their hinges.
A very large number of people were affected either by flying debris or flame or by chemical releases.
A lot of people described smelling ash and being able to feel the heat from the fire that came off these explosions as well. Destruction everywhere because of the size of it and the cloud and the ash and the debris that all came flying as a result of it.
The tragedy is that most of the people who were killed were the people running towards the danger to make it safe. So they were the firefighters and the police who had been called to help their community and limit the spread. So there was a tragic loss of life, many of whom were firefighters, policemen and first responders.
The official death toll for the blasts, as it was last announced by the government, stands at 165. However, there were several missing in the immediate aftermath, some of whom it's unclear if their bodies were ever recovered.
When you see destruction on a scale like this, it is difficult to imagine where and how a cleanup begins.
Drone footage afterwards showed this huge crater that had been left as a result of the explosions. In the days afterwards, it became clear the level of damage as well that's happened from that night. Row upon row of brand new cars that were completely scorched out as well, and residential buildings with almost all their windows smashed out.
Everybody is heartbroken, he told me.
I can't explain how sad I am when I see my home like this, and I hope the government will tell me the truth about what happened.
The hazards presented by the sodium cyanide were so great, the Chinese government ordered the evacuation of everybody within 3 kilometres of the plant while the cleanup could take place.
In general, the cleanup after an accident is very complicated and has to be done with a lot of expert involvement, and that will involve people who are experts in soil, in water, in air, in public health.
The authorities in Tianjin are dealing with poisonous chemicals. Nobody knows what fumes they're breathing in.
The cleanup was massively complicated by the illegal storage of very dangerous chemicals, in particular the sodium cyanide. Sodium cyanide, when it's burnt or when it's dissolved in water, forms hydrogen cyanide, which is an extremely toxic chemical which is very, very dangerous to the environment.
Usually you try and contain any water, so if it rains after an incident, you then have to bund it off and make sure that it can't get into water or sea. And in general, you have to remove a lot of contaminated soil and send it somewhere where it can be treated and any residue removed.
The actual environmental cleanup program would be massive.
The process can take years.
China has for a long time been amassing big gold supplies and mining a lot of gold. One of the things which caused the biggest problem here is the large amount of sodium cyanide. And the reason they had that in such vast quantities is it's used in the extraction of gold. So it's a very, very valuable chemical, which is why they had so much of it.
Ammonium nitrate is a very important chemical product. It's used as a fertilizer, and most of the food you eat has probably had some form of fertilizer involved in its production. So it allows us to farm intensively and feed the growing population. But it's also used as an explosive, so it's used for quarrying, for mining, and it can be handled very safely. One of the reasons it's used in quarrying and mining is so long as you store it correctly, it's extremely stable.
There are a number of regulations, Chinese regulations for the safe storage of these chemicals. For example, regulations state there should be a 1 kilometre exclusion zone around these chemicals. That wasn't applied. Also, the licence to store chemicals had expired in October 14.
The warehouse storing 3,000 tons of toxic material allegedly didn't have a licence to store them until just a few weeks ago.
So it had been storing chemicals illegally for that intervening period.
The amount of ammonium nitrate and sodium cyanide that they were storing was illegal. The ammonium nitrate hadn't been declared, they didn't have a licence to store it.
Both sodium cyanide and potassium nitrate are considered to be too dangerous to be stored in quantities greater than 25 tons in any one site. This is an internationally recognized rule. In Tianjin, 800 tons of sodium cyanide was stored on site, more than 32 times the legal limit, and 1,300 tons of potassium nitrate, over 52 times the legal limit. By overstocking flammable and potentially explosive chemicals, Ruhai Logistics had unwittingly created a disaster waiting to happen.
We don't know the exact conditions that they stored the chemicals in, although it's reasonable to assume, seeing as they were illegally storing large quantities, the conditions weren't great.
When you're storing hazardous chemicals, the first and most important thing is you have to know what you're storing, you have to know what the dangers are, and you have to segregate. So that means not storing acids next to alkalis, not storing flammable materials next to explosive materials, not storing toxic materials, potentially toxic materials, next to flammables or explosives.
They were mixing chemicals which aren't very compatible next to each other, particularly strong oxidizers and fuels.
Segregation is incredibly important. Temperature control and ventilation is also very important.
The initial fire started because of an auto-ignition within nitrocellulose that was stored on the site.
Nitrocellulose is usually stored wet, submerged in either water or alcohol in order to prevent exposure to anything that could cause it to auto-ignite.
The nitrocellulose had been allowed to dry out, which is against normal practice, and once it dried out, it started its normal decomposition process. It built up heat, and when it reached 170 degrees, it auto-ignited. First responders came in, unaware of the other hazards that were around there, and tried to put this fire out with water.
Without any guidance as to what was inside the containers, the firefighters and first responders did what they would usually do, tackling the blaze and covering the surrounding area with large amounts of water to extinguish and prevent further spread of fire.
Now, some of the chemicals were there, particularly calcium carbide, would react very badly to having water played on it. The first responders appeared to have no idea what was stored on that site, which goes against all protocols. The effect of trying to douse this fire with water caused a chemical reaction. Not only did it produce a lot of heat, but then it produced acetylene, which is a very explosive gas, which led to this huge explosion.
The first explosion was so powerful it triggered seismic sensors and registered as a 2.1 earthquake. The second explosion was larger and registered as a 2.9.
The impact was like that of a missile. It does indeed look like a war zone. 114 people died here, 70 are still missing.
Over a year later, China sentenced 49 people for their involvement in those explosions.
In a site like this, there should have been an emergency procedure.
Asking lots of what-if questions. What if something went wrong? What would be your emergency response? Would you evacuate? Would you let the warehouse burn? Or would you actively tackle it?
There should have been somebody available to let them know what was in different areas of the site. There should have been an emergency procedure.
Would you use water? Would you use foam? Would you use extinguishing gases? All the questions that weren't asked by Ruhai Logistics.
So they're angry.
The sentences really ranged depending on varying levels of responsibility, but the harshest sentence was a death sentence for the owner of the facility for storing chemicals so close to residential buildings. Now, that death sentence, doesn't always mean death. A lot of these sentences are later commuted into life in prison.
The reason this dangerous situation occurred is there was a complete failure of regulation. The regulations were there, they just weren't enforced.
The problems continued during the cleanup after the explosion.
Bao Jingling is in charge of monitoring the chemicals and the air quality here. He maintains that both are at standard levels.
These chemicals are up to the standard. I can taste these chemicals.
That's your feeling, not my feeling.
One of the major problems that we had here, I think, is that the port operator was also the regulator. So there was obvious conflict of interest there. There were strong links between the ownership of the company and high officials in the local government. This may have had some effect on the granting of licenses and the enforcement of the chemical safety regulations.
So emotions will continue to run high until the full truth is known.
In the aftermath of the incident, the government did tighten up the legislation. In particular, they brought in new rules requiring anybody holding these dangerous chemicals to notify local authorities of the quantities and location. These rules were rescinded less than 2 years later because they were seen as unnecessary red tape. The failures here are institutionalised problems.
The regulations that existed before 2015, had they been observed, this accident would be much less likely to have happened and the consequences would be much less severe. The company was operating without due regard for the hazards of the materials that it was handling. All accidents are preventable. It's perfectly possible to handle hazardous chemicals safely. In this case, every single rule of safe storage and handling of chemicals was violated. The amount being stored, the lack of segregation, the lack of any plan to deal with a fire or an emergency, the lack of training for the people working in the warehouse, the lack of training for the emergency response teams, all meant that a minor accident soon got out of control.
When people decide that politics and profit are more important than safety, disaster strikes. The chemical engineers that create these volatile materials are more than aware of the dangers they pose. When these substances are stored or transported, there is little they can do but hope that those responsible take the necessary precautions. But when all else fails, it is vital that there is a plan, so that should the worst happen, first responders know what they're fighting. In laboratories all over the world, chemical engineers look to other solutions to make processes safer, experimenting with other chemicals in the search for safer substitutes, as well as looking for efficiencies in whichever process they're completing, meaning less of the dangerous chemicals are transported and stored.